What I thought we'd do in the interest of time is I'll start off with some opening remarks, and then I'll introduce our guest speaker today, the Honourable Erin O'Toole, who will then make a few remarks and a few comments, and then we'll get into some Q&A. And let's get going then. So hello everybody, my name is Paul Holden. I'm the President and CEO of the Burnaby Board of Trade. And it's great to have you here with us today for our business town hall with the Honourable Erin O'Toole, Leader of the Official Opposition. First of all, I'd like to start by acknowledging that this event, well, at least where I am, is being held on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam and Squamish nations. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the annual partners of the Burnaby Board of Trade. We have a phenomenal group of organisations that we work with throughout the year on our programming, events and other initiatives. At the platinum level, we have the Burnaby Now and the BCIT School of Business. At the gold level, we have Simon Fraser University, Pacific Blue Cross, Douglas College, Fortis BC, Electronic Arts, ABC Recycling. And at the silver level, we have Scotiabank, Trans Mountain, Appia Development, Alexander College, Port of Vancouver, and the TD Bank Group. So a fantastic group of organisations that I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with. I'd also like to say hello and welcome. We've got a couple of elected officials from out of town joining us today. We have Shelley Downey, who's a city councillor from Port McNeill in BC. Welcome, Shelley. And we also have Mark Dalton, Member of Parliament for Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, not too far from here. So welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us. I just wanted to share a few words for those of you that may be a little bit less familiar with us as an organisation, just a few words about us and what we do. We are the leading business association here in the city of Burnaby and one of the largest and longest serving business organisations in the province. We've been very much communicating our role as an organisation in recent years, a little bit focused, if you like, on a bit more of the real reason that we exist as an organisation and the real essential and unique and important work that we do on behalf of the business community and the community as a whole. So we've been very much describing ourselves as the catalyst for economic growth, the convener of business and community leaders, and the champion for our local business community. We were the first chamber in the region to reopen our offices in person. This was a while ago now. The first to develop a local PPE supplier guide, and the first and last, as it happens, chamber in the region to host an in-person hybrid event last summer and in November before the regulations changed. And it's a real part of our DNA as an organisation to find a way to find a way to getting things done. And I'm very proud of some of the work that we've done to show that you can operate in a safe and efficient manner by working with the regulations that are out there. Throughout this pandemic, we've been leaders in focusing on recovery and resilience through our work with the city on the Burnaby Business Recovery Task Force. And we've just developed and launched a really exciting initiative called the Centre for Burnaby Business Recovery and Resilience, which is the hub for all of our programming resources related to COVID-19, including our daily updates on government programs, our suite of resilience events, our digital development assistance program, and a number of other initiatives with more exciting supports, which we'll be announcing soon. So for today's event, I'd like to introduce our guest, the Honourable Erin O'Toole, Leader of the Official Opposition. Erin grew up in a GM family in Bowmanville, Ontario, and at the age of 18, he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and completed his studies at the Royal Military College. As a tactical helicopter navigator, he participated in search and rescue missions off Canada's coasts, rising to the rank of captain. And after 12 years of service, Erin retired for the military and returned to school to complete a law degree at Dalhousie University. He spent the next decade working as a lawyer in the private sector and was one of the co-founders of True Patriot Love Foundation, a national charity serving veterans and their families. Elected 3 times in his riding of Durham, Erin has held various positions in the government, including Minister of Veteran Affairs and recently Shadow Cabinet Minister responsible for Foreign Affairs, before being elected Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and the Official Opposition in August of last year. And we're very pleased to have him here today to speak with our business community. For today's session, we'll start with some opening remarks from Mr. O'Toole, and we'll then move into the Q&A, where I'll be asking Erin some questions that we already have received. Feel free yourselves to ask any questions by using the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Lastly, please note that the session is being recorded and will be shared with our members who were unable to attend today. So at this point, I'd like to pass it over to Erin O'Toole for his opening remarks, and then we'll get into the Q&A. Mr. O'Toole.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, Jocelyn, and to the entire Burnaby Board of Trade team for inviting me to speak with you today. Of course, I wish I could be with you in person because British Columbia has always been very important to me. In fact, as a kid, I traveled by train to Expo 86 with my grandfather. As a young military officer, a few years later, I trained at CFB Chilliwack, at boot camp, and later at CFB Comox on the island. And in 2010, a real experience for our family, I joined my wife in Vancouver for a month while she helped work on the Vancouver Olympics as part of the International Broadcasting Consortium. I didn't have to work. I was the lucky husband with the tickets, including seeing Alexandre Bilido win the first gold medal on Canadian soil at Cyprus. That is a truly quintessential moment and memory for me. BC hosted the most incredible games, set the standard, and made Canada proud. And it's great to be here to discuss ways our government can support small businesses, which both your Board of Trade and my team in Ottawa are focused on. As leader of the official opposition, I have a job to do holding the Liberal government to account. With the rise of more COVID cases occurring each day, the growing trend of vaccine nationalism leading to procurement challenges, the milestones for vaccines keep moving further and further away by the day. I take no pleasure in this challenge and the mounting failures by the government to secure a stable supply of vaccines, because the Conservatives, we wanted the government to succeed. Canadians, our health, our future economic prosperity require them to succeed. The very future, in some cases for the small businesses that are some of your members, their future is now at stake. And as I've said a few times, we're at a bit of a crossroads now as a country. And the decisions in the months and years ahead is which path do Canadians want to take? The path being offered by Mr. Trudeau, where he suggests he should reimagine the economy coming out of COVID-19. Reimagining means millions will likely be left behind, or the steady and certain path, securing the future for everyone in all parts of the country and in all sectors. A path that will deliver us to a Canada where those who've struggled the most through this pandemic can get back to work, can provide for their families, can save their small business that is hanging on by a thread. To do this, I recently introduced Conservatives' Recovery Plan for Canada, a plan to secure our future. We will enact, as a first pillar, a comprehensive jobs plan to recover the millions of jobs lost during the pandemic within 1 year, and we won't stop there. Nous allons prendre des mesures immédiates dans les secteurs les plus touchés. Je veux aider ceux et celles qui ont le plus souffert, notamment les femmes et les jeunes. We will rebuild the main streets of Burnaby and the rest of Canada by assisting small businesses and providing incentives to invest in, to rebuild, or in some cases to start new businesses. As universities and college programs have been predominantly online this year, there's been an alarming decrease in revenue for small businesses. I know that one such place in Burnaby was one of the Club Ilia at University City, which had to close permanently from the lack of revenue. Second, we will enact the toughest accountability and transparency laws in Canadian history. Third, this last year has deepened the mental health crisis our communities have been struggling with across Canada. A University of British Columbia study last year found that 65% of respondents reported adverse pandemic-related mental health effects. This number is alarmingly high, and action must be taken immediately. We will introduce a Canada Mental Health Action Plan that boosts funding partnerships with the provinces for mental health care. Too many families have been torn apart because of COVID-19 restrictions and challenges, and far too many have been seen lives destroyed by the opioid epidemic. Last year in British Columbia, you know there were 60% more deaths from opioids than from COVID. This is a national emergency, and we need to create solutions to address it. The fourth pillar of our plan will ensure our country is never unprepared for a crisis again. Canada's Conservatives will make Canada more resilient, reduce our reliance on foreign countries, and take seriously our responsibility to protect the health of Canadians. This includes ensuring that we have domestic vaccine production capacity. Finally, a Conservative government will secure Canada's economy by getting the budget back to balance over the next decade. Spending to protect Canadians during the pandemic is the right thing to do, and Conservatives in opposition, we have supported that. But we all know we cannot pass unsustainable debt to our children and to future generations. Once the recovery starts, a Conservative government will get spending under control, and we will get the economy growing again to secure the revenue needed to pay for the government services that Canadians depend on, from healthcare to old age security. Those are at risk with the current spending approach of the Trudeau government. The decisions we take in the next few months and years will define Canada for this generation and the next. As the father of two, my greatest worry is failing to leave a better Canada for my children. That's what drives me. Canada needs to realize that the next 2 decades will be defined globally by a clash between the United States and the communist regime in China. From trade to human rights, we need to position ourselves accordingly. For many years, I've been advocating for this and for innovative agreements like a CANZUK agreement. This trade and mobility deal would provide a stepping stone for further integration and trade opportunities with the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Imagine the possibilities of exporting your products to these countries tariff-free and linking up to their supply chains. This isn't just a matter of economics. CANZUK is our best political option to build a bloc of aligned democratic countries, one that also diversifies our trade routes and solidifies our intelligence and defense alliances. For the same reasons, we also need to expand our trade relationship with democratic allies in the Indo-Pacific like India. Building trade with India will allow us to reduce our dependence on an increasingly uncertain trade balance with the Communist Party in China. As we recover from COVID-19, it's time for certainty, vision, and competent leadership. It's time for ethical leadership in politics again. That's why every day I'm telling Canadians about the vision Conservatives have for a stronger, more prosperous, and more united Canada. I want you to know that a Conservative government will have your back. Les conservateurs sont prêts à remettre l'économie sur les rails à Burnaby, mais aussi à la grandeur du Canada. Nous pourrons ainsi protéger notre avenir. Canada's Conservatives got us out of the last recession, and I know we can lead Canadians out of this one too. So thank you very much, Paul. I'm looking forward to taking questions from your members.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Erin. So on cue, I'll dive right into some questions. And you know, we were chatting very briefly offline before we started about the fact that yesterday there were some challenging announcements made in terms of some returning to some restrictions here in British Columbia, and a couple of sectors, particularly in the restaurants and fitness centres, but some sectors are also going to be more hit than others. Perhaps you could just share some thoughts on some of the current programs that are out there to support businesses, which may be coming to an end or running down a little bit. Which programs do you think is essential to maintain right now in light of the restrictions, certainly that we're just getting here, but also across the country? Are there any new programs that have just not happened yet that you think might need to come in? And are there some that you just think we kind of need to move on from?
Well, thank you, Paul. You know, for your members, they're probably very familiar with the wage subsidy, of course, which has been important for preserving jobs. The Conservatives, we supported it right out of the gate, and we pushed immediately to change that wage subsidy from a 10% level to 75% to actually save those jobs. I personally intervened with several ministers right away to make sure that it was at a level where the jobs would be preserved, not just shed. The rent assistance programs are another one we supported and then fought for many months to fix, because many tenants weren't qualifying because the original program was going through large landlords, and landlords were opting in or opting out. The small tenants that were suffering often didn't get access to the supports if their landlord did not opt in. It took 6 or so months to change that program, but we fought for that. The HASCAP program, the Highly Affected Sectors Capitalization Program, has also been one that was talked about months ago and was very slow to roll out. But I would look for some businesses that are in some of the highly affected sectors like tourism and others to look at that. The CEBA loan, many of these programs are going to be here until June, from what the government has said, and likely longer with some of them. We've also, for the last few months, wanted specific additional supports for some acutely impacted sectors with money flowing quickly for tourism, hospitality, and the airlines. For 6 months now, the airlines have agreed to a package with refunds, with guaranteeing regional routes, employment levels, and making sure no assistance goes to excessive executive compensation. Once we saw that those concerns we had were addressed, we needed to make sure that a loan or assistance could be there to preserve those airlines and those important regional routes that keep our country connected and keep chambers of commerce or boards of trade like yours in all parts of the country, their members keeping market access open. So that's what we'd like to see more action on, Paul, because right now there are thousands of people out of work, and our competitiveness in those areas is really eroding. So there are a range of programs, and I certainly think your members should take advantage of whatever is there so that they can survive this period to thrive post-COVID.
Thank you. And for some of those sectors that you mentioned, and tourism obviously being one, but there are others that have been highly impacted. Do you think that, what kind of plan would you like to see in terms of if the current number of cases reaches this, or the vaccination levels reach this, then this can happen for those industries in terms of helping them to reopen? Because we all talk about the light at the end of the tunnel, and for certain industries, it seems like a bit of a dim light in a very long tunnel.
You're exactly right. And, Canadians are tired. There's a fatigue setting in. And as we joked at the beginning, your province has led the way. I like to say Dr. Bonnie Henry, the Canadian Forces veteran, has been kind of on the vanguard of the response. So some of the measures of restriction have been lighter in your province than mine, but there's a fatigue setting in, and there are small business owners hanging on by a thread. And what we've been advocating for in the last couple of weeks is a responsible, data-driven, safe plan for reopening. The United Kingdom, the US have all released plans. That doesn't mean we're opening tomorrow, but we need to allow particularly small business to envision what that looks like and on what timeline. The data-driven part should be using the vaccination timelines, particularly for the most vulnerable. It should be using suppression of variants and hospitalization rates so that some areas that are acute risk will have a slower time to reopen, but areas where the risks have been mitigated, we can get people back open and working. And I'll tell you, some small businesses are rightly frustrated that they see large chain stores open in some provinces and small business mom and pop type organizations being forced to very minimal openings or closures. So there's a fatigue setting in. Everyone needs to work together and should. Public health is paramount, but let's plan, because every step of this crisis, and we've tried to work with the Trudeau government, Canada has been 2 to 3 steps behind all of our traditional allies. Nobody likes to see Canada in 50th or 60th place in the ranking of vaccine deployment. So we need to do better. Canadians deserve better. And that's why, as you said, that light at the end of the tunnel, that can be found, that can be envisioned with a safe, data-driven plan for what reopening can be like when we hit certain measures.
Yeah, thank you. We're talking about the obviously vaccines, and I'll just ask a quick question on that in a moment. But I had an op-ed in the local newspaper here where we were saying, just highlighting the importance of a robust vaccination program in order to not just make businesses safe, but to restore that consumer confidence getting back out there again and using those businesses. I've got a meeting in a couple of days actually with our board of directors and with Minister Anand, who's obviously, as you know, is responsible for procurement of the vaccines. What would you think right now? I mean, I know it's easy to look back and say, well, this should have happened X months ago or what have you, but the situation we're in is the situation we're in. What do you think right now would be some of the biggest questions we should be asking and some of the solutions we should be looking for when it comes to procurement and distribution?
Well, Paul, there's three tools that are critical in a pandemic. And those tools, of course, are vaccines, rapid tests, and information. And Canada is slow on vaccine and rapid tests and opaque on information. And in fact, Canadians, especially in the last few days, thousands of Canadians that received the AstraZeneca vaccine, they've been hearing different stories from the government with respect to safety and efficacy of that vaccine. This same government, a few weeks ago, said that Pfizer, the dosing period between first and second dose will change to 4 months. We're the only country in the world. It's an off-label use of a new pharmaceutical product. The company does not support the Trudeau government's move to a 4-month dosing cycle. What does all that mean? The information is eroding public confidence in the health measures being advanced by Minister Hajdu and her team. I hold the politicians responsible for that. And we should have questions. Why is Canada the only country in the world doing that? It's because we don't have supply. So the failure politically on procurement is now leading to an uncertain process for the use of these critical tools in the wellness of Canadians. It's quite frankly shocking that they're so cavalier with these dosing questions and the safety and efficacy of these vaccines. That is going to contribute to vaccine hesitancy. It's going to contribute to uncertainty about the efficacy and safety of these vaccines. Information is key. It's why last fall we asked for a public plan in terms of priority groups for vaccinations. It's why we've asked for transparency on the contracts. When are we going to get the vaccines and on what timeline? The government changes the numbers by the day, almost makes it up as they go along. And I don't think that's responsible. And I really do think Minister Hajdu really needs to be held to account for a shifting scientific message that is based on their failure to supply the vaccine.
Thank you. We've all seen to varying degrees the social impacts of COVID-19, and everyone has been impacted in many ways. The economic impacts of the pandemic have obviously been felt by everybody, but very differently in certain industries and certain groups of communities. What are your thoughts on perhaps why some groups, some demographics, some areas have seen worse impacts, and what can be done to rectify that as we move through the recovery?
An important question, Paul. Thank you. And it's something, the inequality is something I've been talking about for some time. In fact, the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated some of the existing inequalities for Canadians in marginalized groups already. That's become more pronounced. We talk about the she session that impacting women in the workplace. We've been set back 30 years in terms of some of the progress made just by the impact of the pandemic and the economic fallout. So we're trying to make sure, as part of our Canada Recovery Plan, that first pillar, the jobs piece, the 1 million in 1 year, and not stopping there, we're coming up with some innovative ways to try and address some of those inequalities as we get everyone back to work in all sectors and all regions. We also need to make sure that Canadians see benefit as they're recovering, which is why we're working with the private sector to see how can we see more wellness programming in the suites of benefits. It's part of my Canada Mental Health Action Plan. It can be provinces and the federal government working collaboratively, but where can the private sector be there? Because wellness is core to overall health, and that is core to the productivity and the efficiency of your employees and your team. So how can we also learn from the experience in the pandemic. So we're reaching out and trying to make sure that this is part of our dialogue. As a new Conservative leader, I'm also reaching out to union leaders and others to try and build trust where maybe it always hasn't been there with our party in the past. But I want the members of those leaders' unions, I want their economic success to be secured post-COVID. So how can we partner for the long-term wellness of one another? And so this is where, again, I don't think it's time for reimagining our economy or building back better according to what Mr. Trudeau defines as better. We need everybody getting back. Strong families and strong communities will build a strong country.
Thank you. We'll take a break if you're okay with that from specific COVID-related questions, but we will have some more that we'll get back to. We've had a couple of questions around what's been in the news lately with regards to climate change and the Conservative Party, and I wondered if you might clarify your own position personally and your party's position on climate change, and what plans and initiatives do you propose or support to prevent the worst impacts or to mitigate against them? Just as a bit of context, our organization for a number of years has adopted very much a triple bottom line philosophy in terms of economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And I know it's something which is really important to our organization, to our members. So I'd appreciate perhaps if you could expand on that.
Well, thank you, Paul. Climate change is a serious threat to our country, to the world, to our economy. And that threat needs to be addressed with serious policy. It's important to me, as I say, as Conservative leader, but also as a father. When I talk to my daughter, who's 14, that's her number one concern. So how can we have smart, serious policy to address this? And it's important to me professionally before I became a politician. I used to co-host the Earth Day event at my law firm and even held an environmental business luncheon series working on some of these environmental issues in the private sector. I think Canada can lead here. In fact, Burnaby has led, the home of Ballard Power Systems, one of the innovators in this space, looking at reducing emissions through smart technology where Canada can actually be a world leader. So what Canadians are going to see is the Conservative Party is going to have a serious and targeted approach to emission reduction in the next election campaign. I think the most serious offering we put forward, because it's important to me, and I think we have to build trust on this plank. And we're in the process of developing that now, and to show that we can have this approach without a tax that is being tripled, and that will have an impact on some of the people at those margins we talked about in the last segment, Paul. Small businesses don't have the recovery from the federal Mr. Trudeau carbon tax. People at the margins that consume most of the income they have coming in, when that tax is being tripled, they will not get it back. They will be impacted. It also has competitiveness issues. So how can we get the balance right? I've even spoken to former Premier Campbell to talk to him about when he brought in the BC approach to the carbon tax, because I'm in the process of trying to get the balance right. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I think we have some more questions coming through the process on climate and the environment, and we may get back to that if we can. A question that's actually just come through, which is an interesting one, is many employers lost employees to CERB and are still finding it difficult to either bring people back or to hire even a year later. Your thoughts on, and again, hindsight being a great thing, but your thoughts on what a CERB-like program should be doing or should have done?
This is an important question because I think, as I've said, Conservatives have supported the government in programs to help people in a pandemic. It was a crisis. And as I said, we would support and approve the programs and then try and fix them later. The one concern I've highlighted a few times was the fewer jobs we preserved, the slow and awkward start on the wage subsidy and the CEBA loan and some of the ones that were slow to start, and the ease of which CERB could be applied for with no barriers, and then they extended it to students without any rationale for doing that. That caused labor market disruptions that the government hasn't acknowledged. And when I've tried to talk about this, people try and cast it in a different light. I wanted to save as many jobs as possible. The wage subsidy, I would have liked to see overprescribed and less reliance on the CERB. Instead, we had the opposite. We had a massive oversubscribed to the CERB and less taken up on the wage subsidy. And what's that is going to cause is a prolonged hangover of unemployment post-COVID, because they didn't get the balance right. This is why we're launching an ambitious jobs recovery plan, 1 million jobs in 1 year, and keep going, because we need to recover that 600,000 to 700,000 still lost from the pandemic, and about 300 or so of underemployment for many Canadians, and restore the balance for small business, save Main Street, and that the CERB should not have been extended. When I see that hundreds of millions were spent for people at home that were dependents, 15-year-old kids in school, they didn't need the support, but some people at the margins did. So how can we learn from the misapplication of that balance the first time? The more we preserve jobs, the more we can bounce back quickly after COVID.
Yeah, sure. So your thought on the CERB then is conceptually a good program to have been brought in, but perhaps some tweaks, certainly in hindsight, but if it comes again going forward, some tweaks in the qualification process.
Well, if we want to actually go back at the beginning of March, the end of February, beginning of March, before the Trudeau government even acknowledged COVID was a risk, I called on the government to stand up the EI program and to expand it to all Canadians that weren't eligible within it, including self-employed Canadians and others, so that we could have a structure to the program to have a safety net for people. But the priority should have been on saving and preserving jobs. The more we did that, preserve that economic activity, there would have been fewer Canadians that needed to be caught. There was already going to be a crossover of EI and what became the CERB. Why didn't we do it with all the measures and the sort of checks of an EI type program? The government would have continually have had to top up the insurance portion of it. They didn't do that. We supported what they did do, but as I said, the clumsy approach on preserving jobs led to the CERB being massively overprescribed, and that's going to lead to more long-term challenges. And if you look at what BC's report has just done on the guaranteed annual income, the same potential impacts on the labor market would be there from that, without the positive public policy outcomes that some people hope. So we've been looking very carefully at that report out of British Columbia, and we have to learn the lessons from getting the balance right on saving jobs.
Thank you. And on the subject of saving jobs and keeping people employed, a couple of years ago, we had some input from our members, and we were finding ourselves in a situation where a lot of in our stakeholders, that we had a lot of businesses that were finding it hard to find the right people. And equally, we had a lot of community agencies that were working on behalf of people looking for jobs who couldn't get them jobs. So there seemed to be a disconnect, whether it was in training, whether it was in job preparedness, whether it was to do with credentials, whether it was to do with other immigration issues. And so we found ourselves in that position reasonably acutely back in those days. And we suspect that now that's going to be perhaps even more noticeable. I wonder if you could perhaps share some of your thoughts on what your government would do in that area of education, job preparedness, credentials, immigration, etc., in order to fill those gaps, because it's a gap both ways.
Absolutely, Paul. I saw that gap at the tail end of when we were in government. We have a national occupation code for every job in Canada. So the federal government knows where there's shortages, but we don't have a smart enough plan to actually fill the gaps through smart and faster immigration and through smarter and more targeted training opportunities. And those gaps get filled by the temporary foreign worker program, which always doesn't give a fast path to permanent residency. So how can we fix all this? We track it, and this is the business experience in my background. If you measure and track something, use that data for better outcomes. And I'm tired of just these problems being pushed down and pushed down and pushed down the road. It's time to fix it. In fact, Burnaby can be a big part of that. BCIT is probably one of the most innovative places of higher education for training and meeting these critical gaps. I got to know them when we started the True Patriot Love Foundation, and I was doing that as volunteer work out of Toronto. BCIT reached out to us because they were doing veteran training and veteran employment initiatives just on their own. I was blown away by how innovative they were. Let's merge that with a smarter and enhanced approach to skills entry in immigration, so that when we know that there's going to be a prolonged gap, let's leverage all points of the provincial and federal system to fill that gap, from immigration to training dollars to education. Because productivity suffers, as you know, the longer there is that gap, that skills shortage. And when the economy is booming again, these skills gaps and shortages are most acute. So let's use the next few years to make sure that we're faster and become a destination for talent, have better paths to permanent residency for temporary foreign workers, and use federal training in a much smarter way, partnering with great institutions like BCIT.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned about the post-secondary. And obviously, we're very fortunate here in Burnaby to have, locally BCIT and SFU, and then nearby other post-secondaries, and Douglas College is one of our partner level organizations as well. And what we've been finding more than ever is obviously the opportunities that exist for partnership between business and post-secondaries are perhaps more important than ever. They've always been important, and we always look to explore those. But obviously, students are desperate for work integrated learning experience. Businesses are desperate to have people come in and help. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on what we all might be able to do to strengthen those partnerships and to create more of those opportunities.
Well, thanks. Burnaby is very special in that regard. I've got to show equal shout out to Simon Fraser. I have had the chance to be on campus. And in fact, I've consulted some great minds there in terms of some of our policy development. So a great institution. I think we have to leverage innovation and commercialization better, using our universities as they already are, as a natural hub. We're looking at some ways to come up with some creative policy to actually free up some of the capital on the sidelines right now to foster innovation in Canada. It's something I've been talking to for some time. In fact, I've met with not just the Canadian Council of Innovators based out of Waterloo, but their BC chapter, which with an incredible cross-section of startup and innovative companies, including in Burnaby, D-Wave, and some others. So I think there's some really good potential for us to continue the work that universities are doing as hubs, but also freeing up capital from the sidelines and a partnership with government. But I'm a firm believer that our economic recovery, we need to come roaring back. It has to be in partnership with the private sector. The government can't create super clusters and say, you will be the super cluster for X. The private sector, free market, and innovation will come. How can we create a landscape that encourages that and encourages the company to scale up in Canada, not just start up and then sell? So we're trying to come up with some smart policy that will fill out our Canada Recovery Plan in a very detailed way before the election.
Thank you. I'm sure across the country during this whole pandemic period, there are conversations around what is provincial jurisdiction, what is federal, and I think we all know which is which. But obviously, sometimes the federal dollars are needed to support some of the provincial responsibilities. And we're looking at some of the areas such as healthcare and long-term care and education and childcare. So I wonder if you could comment on perhaps what you see the federal government's role in what are traditionally provincial matters. And then perhaps specifically you could talk about childcare, because that's an issue that we've been advocating for many, many years now, is a key business issue in helping people to return to the workforce. And perhaps you could to share a few comments on those.
I'd be happy to, and in fact, the Supreme Court decision last week reminds us that some areas can be dual provincial and federal jurisdiction, but there can also be a national interest for federal government. But the big difference between ourselves and Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals is we don't believe that Ottawa knows best in all circumstances. In fact, why would some of the civil servants in Ottawa know the needs specifically for BC and healthcare or long-term care or something like that than Victoria would. How can we collaborate more? And in areas where there is a national interest, partner, not come up with one size fits all. That extends to a lot of areas, but childcare and other things are included. So where can the federal government partner? But where can we use the tax system, which is, as you said, for better or worse, the federal government has that jurisdiction as the collector of taxes, to recognize the cost on our economy of an absence of childcare solutions for working families, particularly women. I saw this in my own professional career with women in law, where the lack of options caused career disruption, caused a setback of productivity, a whole range of things for the economy. So again, how can the federal government use the tax system, use the immigration system in some cases? Really smart family reunification can sometimes give some families options. That's where we're pledged to work, and we're going to be developing some specific policy on this that we're going to, whenever there's an election, run on, because I see it as a critical issue in terms of making sure we make back those gains that have been lost in the pandemic in terms of women in the workforce. On healthcare, it will be the same. How can we partner to make sure, particularly in provinces very badly hit in the long-term care, Ontario and Quebec in particular, BC fared better. Where can we work on partnerships, whether it's through federal infrastructure dollars or through healthcare transfers, to partner rather than to dictate? That will be the big difference in approach between the Liberals and the Conservatives.
Thank you. And just getting back actually to comments that I think we've all spoken about in terms of the amount of money that's been spent during this pandemic period. And you made a comment earlier about not wanting to overly burden our children's generation and subsequent folks. What are your thoughts on how, when, or the need to specifically and directly repay the debt that we've taken on during this COVID-19 period as a government?
Yeah, it's an important question. I think about each generation cannot just burden the next one with the bad management and indecision or the challenges of an era. So there was going to be large deficits run as a result of COVID, no question about it. But you do need to have a plan to ramp down the excessive spending in a way that's equitable and strategic as people are working. That's why we don't think it's a time to reimagine the economy. It's a time for every cylinder in our engine to be firing. Mr. Trudeau cobbled together about $100 billion worth of debt in good economic times pre-COVID. Raised taxes, we saw capital flight out of Canada. So there were already warning signs pre-COVID. Now an extra $400 billion or so. So that's a $500 billion worth of debt under Prime Minister Trudeau, with no suggestion that there will be any approach to dealing with it. In fact, he's just asked for a 57% increase to the debt ceiling to $1.83 trillion at a time that it's been 2 years since we even had a budget, the only G7 country without a budget. So we want to see the budget. We want to see the plan to make sure that we get the country working again. We see Canada lead in economic recovery from COVID because we've lagged on the response to COVID. We need a plan, as I've said, to get back to balance in terms of the deficit over the course of the next decade, because up front, we will have to help some of those small businesses and other sectors transition and survive so that they can thrive down the road. But the goal is employment and then ramping down the programs in a way that is fair. And then a long-term plan for our competitiveness as a country. We have to send the signal that things can get built in Canada again, that we're proud of what we do here. And that will be a big focus for our government. We can be world leaders in environmental, social governance, and Indigenous leadership. That's going to be a real focus. I think the world needs more Canada, and we need to rebalance global trade patterns to make sure that some of the bad actors of the world aren't benefiting while we're addressing climate change, while we're addressing social governance issues. We should make sure the democratic world purchases its resources and other things from source countries that they can trust.
Thanks. And just on that, so something that we've been advocating for, obviously, throughout this period is that as we recover, and through our Centre for Recovery, we're certainly doing this, we're looking for a growth-led, business-focused recovery. But we're also acknowledging and understanding that the landscape has changed in many ways. The whole remote working, hybrid working, or full working from home is with us and may well be with us for a while. I think something we've advocated for a long while, which is the role of business in working with the community in which it's based to create a healthier and stronger and more resilient community, is an important one, and perhaps more important going forward. What are your thoughts on perhaps, I know you mentioned about building back better or reimagining the economy, but there are things we're going to have to be doing differently. And what are your thoughts on how we might embrace some of those inevitable changes?
Well, thanks. In fact, Paul, I really liked your recovery and resiliency approach. That's really what we have to do to make sure that we're better prepared for disruptions or challenges in the future. We are doing that. In fact, I'm very proud of our team. We've got the youngest cross-section of millennial MPs, and I have several of them in key shadow ministry roles. Raquel Dancho from Manitoba is not just workforce development, but future workforce. And she's reaching out across the board to folks talking about that future workforce, both from a diversity inclusion standpoint, but in terms of making sure we're preparing through training, through retraining, and through higher education, that future workforce. Brad Viss, another millennial MP from the Mission-Mascouy area, is our first shadow minister for housing because of the acute challenges the Lower Mainland faces, that whenever I'm talking to folks, even when I talk to some of the innovative companies in Vancouver, their young workers can't live nearby or are being priced out. The same thing's happening in the Greater Toronto area, my region. So we're trying to build new policies to make sure that we can address some of these issues and try and make sure that we see that recovery across the board. We need all sectors of our economy to be doing well so we can address some of the inequalities and challenges that we have. We can't pick or choose what parts of our country recover when we're faced with $500 billion worth of debt accumulated in the last few years. We need growth across the board, and to make sure that we're striving for excellence in terms of future workforce and coming up with innovative policy solutions to make sure the next generation isn't the first one that can't even consider home ownership as part of their professional life and family life experience. So I'm really proud our team is quite innovative, and we're coming up with really good policies. And this is part of the reason I like doing these events, Paul, is we need to hear what's on the minds, particularly of chambers and boards of trade from coast to coast.
Thank you. And you've mentioned housing a couple of times there. And I suppose it surprised a lot of people that during the pandemic, and certainly here in the Lower Mainland, in the area of the townhouses and detached homes, it's seen an enormous increase in pricing and general house pricing across the board. A lot of work being done, lots of conversations being had around what can be done to make housing affordable across the spectrum, from people in the affordable and social housing area, and also people looking for families who want to afford somewhere near where they work. What are your thoughts on some immediate actions that might be taken to start addressing that kind of issue?
Important question, and that's why I did task one of my BC MPs, Brad Viss, to come up with a set of policies for our next campaign. Certainly supporting some of the initiatives some of the provinces are doing in terms of the supply issue, in terms of foreign ownership and buying, which of course Vancouver and the GVR has been the most acutely hit by that. That's part of it. We're also looking at the federal rules with respect to mortgages and a range of the federal tools that we can do. Are there some innovative tax devices that allow the unlocking of parents' RSPs or other things? Because if you actually look into it, most young people are getting support for down payments through family members? Can we incentivize that? This will be an area where collaboration between provinces, municipal leaders, and the federal government will be key. And we will be launching a series of specific policies that we think will help, because yeah, the low interest rate environment and the savings that some people have had throughout COVID has led to even more voracious bidding wars in some parts of the country in a pandemic where other people are falling further on the margin. So again, this is an area that is exacerbating some of the inequalities out there.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for those comments. I think we've got time really just for one last question that I have here, and it's a kind of a two-part question. We're hearing talk about and thoughts around a spring or summer election, and appreciate your thoughts on that, and also what it's been like working in a minority parliament situation.
Well, first, I think we have to get the vaccines deployed, the variants dealt with before we worry about votes. Vaccine, variants dealt with, no votes, 3 Vs. And that should be our priority as a country. I'm not sure why, other than the fact that the attention of the country has been on the crisis and not on other issues like the WE scandal and other things. I can't think of why Mr. Trudeau has been posturing in this way. I don't think it's in the country's interest. We have to make sure health and our economic well-being is safe. And I think the fact that Mr. Singh has said they'll support the budget, I don't think there's going to be a big budget crisis that the Liberals maybe were hoping there would be. We've supported measures that have helped Canadians. We're just pushing for better, from vaccines to support for small business. That's what the Conservatives are there for. The minority parliament has been interesting in the fact that we've been able to set the tone on a few issues. Several weeks ago, I was quite proud of the Conservative team, my team, but also MPs from all parties, with the exception of Mr. Trudeau and his cabinet, for recognizing the genocide with respect to the Uyghur minority population that is being perpetrated by the Communist Party of China. That should concern people, that this is taking place and impacting millions of people on the other side of the world. I think Canada has long been a champion for human rights, and we need to be. So we were able to put that motion forward, and I was quite proud that Parliament, with the exception of the cabinet, adopted it. We've also brought forward these debates for critical help for small business, highly affected sectors, for the airline sector. We've won votes and brought forward motions to try and stop punishing audits on small businesses from CRA in the midst of a pandemic. They're being audited, they can barely hold on, and they feel the tax man's on top of them. We've provided some bills that are providing relief for farm families and other things. So the minority has actually allowed us to push forward a number of things, particularly for small businesses, Paul, that I think your members would like. And it's an example of a government in waiting. I wish I could be out there. As I said, I love BC. I've had great interactions throughout my career, but I haven't been there as opposition leader because of the pandemic. And if more people get to know, here's a kid from the middle class of the Toronto suburbs who served in uniform for 12 years, worked in the private sector for a decade, understands job creation, has always given back, whether through the Legion, whether through supporting charity events and other things. And as minister, I turned around a department that was in crisis by building a team, setting a vision, and delivering. That's what Canada needs to recover from COVID. So the more people that get to know me, I think they know that we can have change, we can have ethical leadership again, and Canada can lead as opposed to lag.
Erin, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure meeting you, albeit virtually, and thanks for being open to answer so many questions on so many different subjects. We really appreciate that, and on behalf of our members and the attendees here today, I'd like to thank you for that.